Sometimes when people say, miracles can't happen, so they couldn't have happened back then because we know they don't happen today. And I'm like, there's plenty of witnesses for them today. But I like to give the illustration. You've come across a traffic accident and the officer is interviewing witnesses. And then somebody comes up and says, wait, don't listen to them. That's not what happened. And the officer says, well, tell me what you saw happen. I didn't see anything happen. I wasn't there. That's why I know it didn't happen. We wouldn't take that seriously. But when it comes to miracles, people do that. They say, well, we know that didn't happen unless we see it for ourselves, which is what Thomas also said.
Welcome back to Faith Lab. We're here today with Dr. Craig Keener. And what's super fascinating about Craig is he went from an atheist who was making fun of Christians to their faces to one of the most published New Testament scholars in the world, over 30 books, including a 4-volume commentary on Acts, and of course his prize-winning Christobiography. And then last year, his book, Suffering, Its Meaning for the Spirit-Filled Life. So super grateful and glad to have you with us today.
It's great to be with you, Nate.
Okay, so I got to ask right out of the gate, you were a smug atheist is what I've read. You mocked Christians, and now you're one of the most respected Bible scholars alive. Okay, so take us through that. What did that look like? How did that happen for you to go from point A to point B there?
You've heard of intellectuals. Well, I thought I was an intellectual. I was an intellectual snob is what I was. I wasn't very well informed about religion, but I had read about different religions and different philosophies. It was actually reading Plato that started turning me around a little bit, because I was a pure naturalist and I didn't have a religious background at all. But when I was reading Plato, it started to raise questions about like the immortality of the soul. And I didn't think he argued his case really well, like dependent on the preexistence of the soul and so on. I'm like, I don't remember any preexistence, but I thought his questions were really good. And I started, I was still officially an atheist, but I started saying, if there's any God out there or anything like a God who's listening, please show me truth. And that's not a bad place to start. And I was doing that because it seemed to me that we're finite. I had a beginning, I was going to have an ending, and if there was any such thing as eternal life or life after death or anything, it would have to be guaranteed by somebody or something infinite, and it would have to really be a somebody, because it'd have to be somebody who cared about us enough to make it available to little finite beings like us. So that was like a seed planted. What I didn't know was that I had some relatives who were praying really hard for us. And they didn't express it vocally, because a certain member of my family had said, don't talk to our kids about religion. So they didn't talk to us about religion, but they talked to God about us. And anyway, one day, a couple fundamentalist Christians stopped me on the road and shared with me about Christ. I argued with them for 45 minutes until finally I hit them up with what I thought was the ultimate question for a Christian. If there's a God, where did the dinosaur bones come from? You ask a stupid question, you get a stupid answer. They said, the devil put them there to fool us. That was a stupid answer. They hadn't been trained in paleontology, but they had given me the gospel. They explained that Jesus died for me so I could be made right with God, that Jesus rose from the dead. And so the whole way home, I was experiencing something I'd not experienced when studying various other religions or philosophies. I felt like God was trying to get through to me. God was watching me. And when I got home, I was so overwhelmed by what I recognize now as the presence of God and the Spirit of God. I said, okay, God, I always said that if you were real, I'd give you everything. And one reason I figured God wasn't real was because it seemed to me that most Christians didn't live like they really believed he was real. They didn't give their whole lives to him. So, okay, now, God's in the room with me. What am I going to do? So, God, if you're real, I owe you everything. And so I don't understand how Jesus dying or rising from the dead, how they can make me right with you. But if that's what you're saying, I'll believe it. But God, I don't know what next. I don't know how to be made right with you. So if you want me to be right with you, I need you to do something yourself. And I was overwhelmed with God's presence, and just I felt something rushing through. I know this isn't normal, but I felt something rushing through my body like I'd never felt before. And I jumped up, scared out of my mind, like, what just happened? But I determined, okay, well, now I know God is real. Let me start doing what I guess I should do. And got a Bible and started reading it.
I had a similar experience. I was raised in a kind of a secular Jewish home and became an atheist, I don't know, third or fourth grade. I just thought all the religion was silly nonsense. But I ridiculed my friends in high school who were inviting me to Bible studies and things. There are football games on Friday nights, guys, really? But once I discovered some of the Old Testament prophecies, Micah 5:2, Isaiah 53, I was dumbfounded that, why hadn't anybody ever told me about these before? These look pretty compelling, right? So I remember, though, meeting other Christians who had the kind of experience you just mentioned that I never had, this feeling, this experience of God indwelling me. And I always thought that would be a wonderful experience to have to give me more assurance, not just that it's true in general, but true particular for me. And then it dawned on me maybe a decade later that some of those same people that I had met that had experiences were no longer Christian. And I've talked to people before, who say that it's sometimes hard, even when you have experiences, to share that experience with others because they say that's good for you. And since that time, I've kind of landed at the place where I'm actually glad that I know that God does give people sometimes experiences, but I anchor my faith on there's no other story like this. Like Eusebius in the 3rd century says, it's very clear that this is a divine text because it was written in advance and fulfilled in it. Just look around. All the promises of the Hebrew Scriptures have come true. The world is now following Jesus in so many ways. What do you think about some of those themes?
Yeah, for sure. That's true. One of Eusebius's works was the Preparatio Evangelica.
That's the one I was quoting. Proof of the Gospel. Yeah.
If I'm pronouncing the Latin correctly, I'm not sure. But anyway, he wrote in Greek. But yeah, that's for sure. And yeah, I mean, prophecies about people from all nations coming to worship the one true God. Well, that's been happening. And then today I was reading Psalm 89 again, and the promise of a ruler from the house of David, and how the psalmist was discouraged because it looked like it wasn't happening. And just thinking, wow, today, if somebody came from the house of David, nobody would know that they were from the house of David. But in the 1st century, people still knew who was from the house of David. And so Jesus fulfilled that and so many other things. So
I actually talked to a rabbi about the prophecies from Micah 5:2 because it was one of these huge prophecies for me. Out of Bethlehem shall come the one whose origins are from old, from everlasting, and he shall speak peace to the nations. So that I remember talking to him about it, and he said, well, that's not really talking about the Messiah. It's talking about the fact that Jesus will be related to King David, or sorry, the Messiah will be related to King David. And I said, well, if that's true, I don't think that text is saying that, but if it was true, how are we going to prove that that's going to happen now that all the records are destroyed? He said, oh, that's a good problem.
Yeah.
Wasn't convincing.
Yeah. And even in antiquity, when people who didn't believe in Jesus complained about certain things about him, nobody denied that he was from the house of David.
Yeah, right.
And yeah, and actually, the detractors didn't even deny that Jesus performed the miracles. They just attributed it to a different source.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that last line there in Micah 5:2, Micah 5:4 says, "And they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth." So there is someone who's from the house of David who will be born in Bethlehem. Micah is after David, and he will be great to the ends of the earth. Do we know of anybody else who was born in Bethlehem who's great to the ends of the earth? I think there's only one, really,
Yep,
other than
that's
David, but
it.
he had already died by this time.
Yeah.
Hmm. So, okay, I'm curious how you go from, so you're an atheist, you have that experience, and so you get the feeling stuff first, right? You feel the presence of the Lord first. And then when do you go into, you want to give your whole life to this. So for you, did that mean I'm going to study this and and then is that what led you into New Testament studies and becoming, of this published academic? And was it a straight line there?
Well, I did have a lot of questions left over. I mean, I had the experience, but I didn't know how to, where did the dinosaur bones come from? I mean, I wasn't a paleontologist, but I was thinking back then of becoming one, or an astrophysicist, because I was interested in questions of meaning, and I thought the meaning was found in the universe. And yet God has revealed himself there, but where I especially came to look was in scripture. And at first, I didn't know how to read it properly. I didn't take into account different genres. I didn't know, how. I was trying to read it through the lens of math and science instead of literature and history. And so, although I was very much immersed in other kinds of ancient history, like when I said Plato, ancient philosophy, but I read Thucydides and Tacitus and all those things before I became a Christian. So once I became a Christian, I was intuitively reading the Bible in light of some of the genres with which I was familiar, but I still had so much learning to do. And yeah, if somebody knew me then and just heard me now, they'd say, that's not the Craig Keener I knew. He was he was very immature back then. But that's true. It takes a while sometimes.
Do you think a lot
But
of Christians today don't give a lot of emphasis on understanding various kinds of genres and seeing that the Bible is a library? It's got history, law, apocalyptic, biography, as you mentioned, the Christo biography, the biography. It's its own unique genre, really. Do you think that, like, especially when it comes to the Old Testament, there's just this, I don't know, the sense of we read it as a text almost in a narcissistic way. The text is about me primarily. These are moral tips for me to figure out how to slay the Goliath in my own life instead of reading it according to the way it's actually presented or the way it was interpreted in ancient Jewish life and times.
yeah, and sometimes there are applications like um, when Abraham was getting ready to sacrifice Isaac, there was a saying that arose from it that was used in ancient Israel. Um, there are things like that, but yeah, for the most part, it's showing us the history of God's works, and therefore why we can trust Him. Our trust is grounded in what God has already done before us, and some of the genres we're not as familiar with, so it's difficult to read Israelite law in certain ways. But if you're familiar with ancient legal texts, it's like, okay, it addresses the same kinds of issues as other cultures' legal collections, but certain kinds of differences, like it eliminates certain class differences, um, and like the Code of Hammurabi does say eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but it also says anybody who harbors an escaped slave, the penalty is death. Whereas Deuteronomy says you're supposed to harbor an escaped slave. Don't return the slave to their
Yeah, it's a big
slaveholder.
difference.
Yeah, there are a number of differences that stand out more when you understand the context of
Or another one of
verse
the
being
differences
used.
between Moses and Hammurabi is like if you have a person accused of a crime, throw them in the river, and if they sink, we'll know they're guilty. Now, Moses, on the other hand, says, let there be 2 or 3 witnesses. In other words,
Right.
corroborated testimony, which is the hallmark of our jurisprudence to this day. Now, we
Mm.
don't do a lot of throwing people into the rivers to see if they sink.
Thank God.
I love that about that, Shane. That was one of the big things when I first found your show, Humble Skeptic Podcast, when I was sort of coming back to Christianity, was just I love like investigative journalistic shows where they're like digging into the evidence and
True
I
crime.
mean, that's just true crime.
Yeah.
I love that stuff. But I found your show, Shane, and you were talking about how the Bible actually, when we look at the scriptures that we have, we see evidence of this. We see evidence of, like you said, corroborated testimony, of investigation, of asking us to trust or to look at the evidence. And you see like with Thomas as well, but you also see it in the Old Testament when you talk about like the prophets, right? Like they need to have actually what they say comes true, and then you trust them. You trust them with small
Yeah.
things. You look at small things, and
Yeah.
then you can trust them with larger things. Like taste, and see. Like, yeah, I'm just curious how you
Deuteronomy
think about those kinds of
13,
things.
Deuteronomy 18. Yeah, it's crucial. And then, I like to focus on Luke's prologue. It's like, here's why,
Yes.
Theophilus, you can have certainty. He doesn't say, he doesn't offer internal witness. People can have internal witness, but he doesn't offer that to Theophilus. What he says is, by the testimony of those who saw him fulfill these things among us.
Yeah. And you guys remember last week when I was on your show talking about paleobotany, right? No,
Last
you don't
week?
remember that.
Oh, you scared me.
I was so confused.
No, you have reason not to remember that because it didn't happen.
Right.
But notice what Luke says to Theophilus. He says, I'm writing to confirm the things you already know. So this stuff was in circulation. Luke
Right.
can't make it up. He's confirming things that were already widely circulated. And Luke is doing what a historian today would love to do. We like to go consult witnesses. Well, Luke had, unlike us, Luke had access to first century witnesses and was able to investigate these things. And actually, the wording that's sometimes translated investigate there, David Messner has done work on ancient historical prefaces. And that same Greek wording appears in other ancient historical prefaces, not just for investigation, but for thorough acquaintance. And thorough acquaintance often meant, in these ancient historical prefaces, something learned through participation. And that makes good sense of Acts 16:10 through the end of the book of Acts, because in Luke's second volume, he often says we. And I know, as an author on Acts, I know that there are different opinions about what the we means, but the general consensus on the genre of Acts is it's historical monograph. And I've never found any other ancient historical works or ancient biographies where an author uses we or I and doesn't actually mean real participation. So even though scholars sometimes disagree on what the I or we means, I think it actually means I and we.
What's interesting to me is the fact that the very first we passage in Luke's collected writings is there in verse 1 of chapter 1 of Luke's gospel. The things that have been completely fulfilled among us. To me, it has a Jewish flavor because it's the promised fulfillment expectation. And then it's the things fulfilled among us, which he's including himself in some way, perhaps even Theophilus. What do you think about that possibility when you add to it what you just mentioned from verse 3, that word, when I looked up that particular Greek word in that particular construction recently, I'm writing a book on Luke. What I found were 3 other passages. One was Josephus, one was Philo, one was Papias. And they use this word like having been a follower, and they contrasted that with research by investigation. It was physical presence, having been a physical follower, contrasted with knowing something through others. So I think it's possible to, not just possible, but I think it's, in fact, I just did some research and I found that, presidents from Oxford used to promote this view, but it's kind of been a lost idea that that's what that verb meant. It's basically he's actually arguing he's not a dependent witness on those other eyewitnesses. He himself, it's a parallel clause, verses 3-4, that he's actually saying, just like they had been eyewitness, these other witnesses, he too is going to show Theophilus what he saw, because he had been a follower from the beginning. What do you think about that? Whether that is a possible interpretation?
I think if he'd been at the empty tomb or the day of Pentecost, I think the we material, the first person usage probably would have started earlier, but certainly he was on my view, certainly he was a companion of Paul. So from Acts 16 on.
There have been some who've argued that he was one of the 70, so that he's there to some extent in the, not one of the 12, but he's, I think you find that in people like Origen or later, arguing that he was a follower of Jesus, but that that's something also John Wenham mentions as a possibility. He was the first one that made me realize that there's a possible interpretation there, that he's had been a physical follower of Jesus, not a metaphorical follower. Do you follow Jesus or are you following the idea? And what does it mean that he was a follower from the beginning? If he's Lucius from Cyrene in Antioch with in the book of chapter 13, then he could have been, why would you be a teacher in Antioch if you hadn't been a follower from the beginning? There were plenty others who could tell you what Jesus thought and said. So, but if he's not there except for at the feasts, maybe he kind of leaned on the testimony of Peter and others. So that's why he doesn't sort of mention his own first-person witness. He kind of leans mostly on what the others had said.
That's possible.
Possible. I got a possible, Nate.
I want to come back to the Gospels as well. Why are you convinced that the New Testament Gospels are trustworthy and something we should bank our lives on? Like if someone was to tell you, like, I don't believe it, like, where would you go? What would you say to them to convince them of the trustworthiness of these texts that we have?
There are a number of reasons, and we've already mentioned some things in Luke's preface that outline his methodology and his approach to the material. It's clearly a historical preface. Now, Loveday Alexander is a scholar who examined it and said it's like a scientific preface, but she clarified afterwards that she wasn't denying it was a historical preface. She was saying that there's different kinds of historians, and this was closer to the technical, scientific way of writing history as opposed to the more rhetorical way of writing history. So, but in terms of my own research, most scholars think that the genre to which the Gospels are closest is the genre of ancient biography, which is not exactly the same as the way we do modern biography, but obviously they're related, which is why we can use the same term for both. Bios was an ancient label for them, but there can be overlap among genres, but ancient biography in this period, the first century, was a form of historiography. So it was a form of historical writing. And what I did, and actually some of my PhD students did this, and actually developed dissertations out of this as well. So meticulous research on this. What were ancient biographies like, especially in this period? So what can we say about them? Did they have historical intention? Were they trying to be information-based works? Or did they have freedom to just make things up? I had a professor in my doctoral work. He was the only professor who was like this, but My first semester at Duke, where I was doing my PhD, and again, don't think anything bad about Duke, because again, the other professors didn't do this, but he said, ancient, the Gospel of Mark is an ancient biography. Ancient biographies were fictitious, therefore the Gospel of Mark is fictitious. And I said, wait a minute. I thought ancient biographies were mainly historical works, and I gave him some of the evidence that I'm going to try to give now. And he said, I don't know. I don't know anything about ancient biography. I read it somewhere. Never trust anything a scholar tells you. No. But if you actually go back and look at ancient biographies, you can make like the way we can do with the Gospels, and especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You can compare them and see how much overlap there is, which shows that they're based on information. They're not just making things up. You can do that with most ancient biographies from this period. And so I did that with some of them. I took the Roman historian Otho and showed what different biographers and historians, especially from like within 50 years or so after Otho, there's just so much overlap, showing that they were information-based. And then some of my students developed this with other ancient biographers.
I was going to ask, are you familiar with Caleb Friedemann? Did he study
Yes.
under you?
No, he didn't study under me, but I was very pleased to see his work.
Yeah, if we had him on, so definitely everyone go check out Caleb Friedman's episodes on ancient biography, exactly, and the gospel birth narratives, I think is what he focuses on. But yeah, it's as you're talking, I'm like, this sounds a lot like some of the work that Caleb did. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I was very pleased to see his work on ancient birth narratives, because that was one area I wasn't quite ready to touch, because a little bit further back than the writing of more recent, like the Passion narrative, that's within a generation of when the biographers are writing. But then the birth narratives are like 30 years earlier, and there's some different other factors. But he did a great job with that. So went beyond what I was doing. But what I did when I looked at ancient biographies, ancient biography was primarily historical. It was information-based. But of course, people recount history from different perspectives. And some people are better historians than others, and some people are more concerned about getting things right than are others. And what I found as I examined ancient biographies was there was a development in ancient biography. So when you have Plato or Xenophon writing about Socrates, they take a lot of freedom. They're kind of what I would call proto-biography. They're about half a millennium before the Gospels. But when you get to, you get to the end of the Roman Republic, so a generation before what we call the Roman Empire, Augustus, Caesar, and so on, you have Cornelius Nepos, and he's clearly information-based. He's sometimes sloppy, but he's clearly information-based. And then you get to the period of the Roman Empire. And so from the period of Cornelius Nepos, at the end of the Roman Republic, through the early empire, at least into the 2nd century, and some in the early 3rd century, like especially Diogenes Laertius, who one of my students did a dissertation on Diogenes Laertius and his use of sources, where he normally prefers the sources closest to the events and so on. He cites, Dionysius cites hundreds of sources by name, and elsewhere sometimes just says, the sources say, and so on. I mean, he's clearly information-based, writing in the early 3rd century. So especially in the period of the early Roman Empire, that was the heyday, that was the apex of historical accuracy, historical interest, caution, however you want to put it, in ancient biography. So our key examples are Plutarch and Suetonius and Tacitus' biography of his father-in-law Agricola, and then later you have Lucian writing usually satire, but he writes some biography too, and writes about historical standards. And one of his biographies is about a sage, and Dionysius. Sorry, I'm thinking of Dionysius of Halicarnassus because one of my students just did his dissertation on that. Dionysius of Halicarnassus was a historian, but he also wrote about how to write history properly, and so people will read it. But Diogenes Laertius in the early 3rd century, he's writing about sages. And then Suetonius and Tacitus, and Plutarch writes about different things, various figures, but often about public figures. So these kinds of biographies about public figures with a beginning, a middle, and an ending, full biography, not just, sometimes people talk about the lives of poets. These are just little, sometimes short, like a couple paragraphs long, but full ancient biographies from this period. Actually, the Gospels fit into this genre where they have overlap about events. So they are not only ancient biography, but they're from the period where ancient biographies took the greatest concern to depend on historical information. And not only that, but they are written within living memory of the person
That's a
about whom
key
they write.
insight. Yeah. One of
But
the
yeah,
things that I studied once was just the difference between Homer and his preface between him and Herodotus and Thucydides. Homer
mhm,
talks about these are the things. Tell me, O Muse. The Muse. It's a divine text. The Muse, the
education, yeah,
goddesses, they said it.
mhm,
That's why you can believe it. And then
uh-huh,
Herodotus and Thucydides say these are the researches of our investigation. So that's a
mhm.
different way of telling history, right? But I think, tell me if you agree. I think a lot of modern Christians, if you ask them, why do you trust it? They will kind of answer in a Homeric kind of a way. This is true because it's God's word, without sort of appealing to the way that God told the story providentially through people like Luke doing this sort of classic. People like Ramsey said that he was one of the best ancient historians.
Yeah, yeah, and a number of other people have said things like that too. I know a lot of people that don't trust Luke, but I mean, you look at some of the research that's been done. There was Colin Himmer
Yeah,
did
that's
a
an
book.
excellent book.
He's got like 100 pages of external corroborations for Luke. And in my Acts commentary, I cited 45,000 extra biblical references from antiquity, many of them just showing the correspondences that you get from Luke. But
Do you think
living
sometimes
memory,
what
yeah,
happens is you get these small little objections, say the census, for example, that sticks in people's mind. This is why it's legendary and it's popularly told. But to me, it's like a missing tile to this beautiful mosaic. Like whatever, even if that wasn't resolved, even if there isn't a good answer for that one, which I think there is. But if you look at the whole, this is a masterpiece that, every little thing that Luke's history has been corroborated with by secular history. It's amazing. And then people haven't been told that story.
yeah,
And often they only hear the census thing. And I mean, that was me sort of. It's just you hear those things, you see the speed bumps, but you don't see all the straight road that is right there for you. And like you said, Shane, often the speed bumps have good answers or good, at least plausible, very plausible.
And if you go
ways
to
around
a
them.
lot of Christian churches, they're not talking about it. They're only talking about the feeling or the experience, which there are feelings, there are experiences, and that's an important part of Christianity. But there are other parts too. Like we have the most incredible book that's ever been written, and we should
yes.
talk about it more.
and virtually all ancient historians, scholars find mistakes in them, but they depend on them, and on, especially on those written within living memory, they depend on them because they're substantially accurate. So again, even if you can't, figure out the census, that you've got so many corroborations. And in terms of living memory, oral historians, when they talk about living memory, what they're talking about is the period when eyewitnesses are alive, or those who knew the eyewitnesses are alive. What you have after that period, oral tradition, can be substantially accurate. What it does, it tends to condense things down to the most important elements, but it's not of the same quality as things within the period of living memory, which is often figured to be about 60 to 80 years. Well, all of the Gospels, by the most common critical datings, all 4 Gospels are well within that period. When people talk about lost Gospels and stuff, all of them are beyond that period. So, there's a reason why the early church focused on these 4 and no more. They wanted them to be from the circle of the eyewitnesses. That's a good historiographic principle. And compare
Yeah,
it,
there's a
for
reason why
example.
Tatian in the
Oh, yeah,
150s or so condenses Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John
yep,
into a single narrative. Like those were
exactly.
the only reliable texts in the middle part of the 2nd century to do that.
Yeah, that's true. Often dated around 170 or so, but Irenaeus around 180. You've got the same thing in a completely different part of the empire. So you've got a consensus among the mainstream churches, even though you have like a group here, or a group there that are focused on something else. But what they say about these other texts is, well, this was passed on secretly, which is just plainly admitting that they don't have any evidence that this was publicly available information, quite contrary to what Luke says. But take Arrian's biography, or historical monograph about Alexander the Great, 5 volumes, very detailed work, often considered the most reliable, certainly the most thorough biography of Alexander the Great. Arrian is writing in the mid to late 2nd century about Alexander the Great, who died in 323 BC. That's like 450 years later. But the normal critical dating of the Gospel of Mark is about 40 years later. So like 1/10 of the length and time. And yet many people will just accept the substance of what Arrian says about Alexander. And then when it comes to Mark, oh, no, that's a religious text. That's different. Or that's that belongs to a world religion. Well, not when it started. It was a pretty small
Yeah.
group, but also within living memory of when Mark is written. Papias, very early 2nd century, says that in the 1st century, toward the end of the 1st century, he knew some people who actually knew Jesus, and they were certainly around when the Gospel of Mark was written, and they told him that Mark wrote his Gospel based on the recollections of Peter. And it's not just Papias. I mean, Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century says that, calls the Gospel of Mark the memoirs of Peter. So, and they, the 2nd century church fathers often spoke of the Gospels in general as the memoirs of the apostles.
That's
Not
right.
that every one of them was an eyewitness. They actually privileged Matthew and John because they thought those were eyewitnesses and that Mark and Luke weren't. But in any case, works within living memory are of a different quality. And on average, I mean, we can't go back and evaluate everything directly, but we can say, just based on what we know of works from within living memory, that we can expect that on average, the stories that they're going to tell are going to be accurate, as opposed to, somebody writing 500 years later,
I want to talk
which
to you
is,
about. I want to ask a question about John. You just mentioned that Matthew and John as being eyewitnesses, and there are a few
well,
texts
the
in
early,
John's
early church
gospel.
did that.
Yeah, yeah. couple passages where well, first of all, it starts off with, he has dwelt among us. There's that among us language again. And we have seen his glory. There's a we passage there. And uh, he who has seen this is telling the truth, referring
Yes.
to the crucifixion.
Yes.
There have been those over the last 150 years who've argued that John is theology, not history. You wrote a 2-volume commentary on John. What do you think about the state of New Testament scholarship today about the fourth gospel? Do you think it's changing its view of John in terms of its historical value?
To some extent, it is. Paul Anderson and the John, Jesus, and History group at SBL have made some significant advances, I think. And actually, when you do those comparison charts that we do with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's actually, I ended up doing it with John and found, wow, there's a lot there. I didn't do it in my John commentary. I did it passage by passage where relevant, but later on I just compiled it and it wow, there's a lot of overlap here with the others. I
Yeah.
mean, again, John is not just making things up. Now, John is more explicit about his theology than are some of the other authors. So John is very theological, but the idea of theology, not history, that's a bogus dichotomy.
Right.
You have ancient biographers and historians often would state up front that they were compiling this information for the purpose of teaching something practical that would get more people to read it because they could use it, So they would teach political lessons, military lessons for those who wanted not to repeat mistakes of the past, moral lessons, and biographies especially did a lot with moral lessons, and sometimes theological lessons. Dio Cassius, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, whom I mentioned earlier, Josephus, certainly, where he talks about the reasons for the fall of Jerusalem. These were standard practice in ancient historiography. They were not standard practice in ancient novels. Novels were, with very few exceptions, were almost entirely just for the purpose of entertainment, as opposed to history, which was supposed to be engaging literarily, but it wasn't supposed to be just entertaining. It was supposed to engage you and teach you moral lessons based on real information. That was its
And that's
distinctive
the
feature.
the real part is emphasized over and over again in John. Like the word witness comes up something like almost 30 times, and he wants people to believe that these things are really true. He testifies over and over again. That language of testifying, witnessing, it's everywhere in that
Yep.
text.
Yeah, even at the climax, at the end of chapter 20, Thomas believes because he sees, and then John says, these things are written so that you who haven't seen may believe. Why? Because based on the testimony of those of us who did see.
Yeah, and that's not it's not an argument for blind faith. It's actually an argument for just what Paul says, faith comes by hearing, that sort of testimony that is deposited by the collective witnesses. Peter says this over and over again. We were given this, by the witnesses that were prepared in advance ahead of time. Many witnesses who saw what he did and throughout Galilee, if you just go through the book of Acts, you see this same emphasis over and over to that which has been attested, to that which has been seen that was not done in a corner. This is common knowledge. Those themes are everywhere.
Yeah. History can't really function without testimony. Sometimes when people say, miracles can't happen, so they couldn't have happened back then because we know they don't happen today. And I'm like, there's plenty of witnesses for them today. I mean, you might say that's not really a miracle. The person came back to life just, spontaneously or whatever after 6 hours, whatever explanation you want to use. But I like to give the illustration, you've come across a traffic accident and the officer is interviewing witnesses And then somebody comes up and says, wait, don't listen to them. That's not what happened. And the officer says, well, tell me what you saw happen. I didn't see anything happen. I wasn't there. That's why I know it didn't happen. We wouldn't take that seriously. But when it comes to miracles, people do that. They say, well, we know that didn't happen unless we see it for ourselves, which is what Thomas also said. And Jesus responded to Thomas, but usually we have to depend on testimony.
That's right.
And
There
so
was
what
a
we do, we evaluate the credibility of the testimony.
there was a great story that David Hume tells about this prince in Siam who refused to believe in ice because he was in a climate where that sort of thing never happened, and they didn't have refrigerators or freezers in those days. So he just refused to believe it, especially when he said, the bay freezes over to such an extent that people can walk across it, including elephants. And he said, okay, now I know that you're full of it.
Yep.
But David
but
Hume says that's actually a reasonable argument because
That's
from
what
his
Hume said.
present experience, and I think that that's just ludicrous because what you have to focus on is maybe the world is different from your experience. Maybe it's broader than your experience. Maybe bizarre,
Exactly.
weird things can happen, and you can't be a scientist unless you hold that.
Yep.
Well, I think
Exactly.
even scientists today, I mean, I've heard this number that they say and I don't even know how we would know this. How does anyone know how much you don't know? But they say we don't understand 97% of the universe, which, right? How do you know if you're giving up that you don't know 97%? How do you know that it's 97%? That's always my question.
More.
But even just that that they're admitting that they don't know 97%. I go like, but how then can we be so sure that we know that certain laws cannot be broken in certain ways? It's like, I don't know. I'd be a little more skeptical on that.
Sometimes
agree.
the paradigm does the thinking for you. One last question about Gospel of John before we move off of that territory. I don't know if you're familiar with this book by George Van Coten. He is the Cambridge professor at which college? Anyway, he's written this book arguing that John is probably dated before the Jewish War, and he's convinced a lot of people like N.T. Wright and Richard Bauckham to revise their dating. Other people are moving too: John Dixon, Peter J. Williams, Michael Gorman. They're moving to this pre-70 date for John, and one of the key arguments from Van Coten's work is the Pool of Bethesda scene in John 5:2. He says that it's not only a present tense language there is in Jerusalem, but it's also by the sheep gate of the temple and this place of 5 porticos. You mentioned in your commentary that that's, we know from archaeology that really existed. So John is giving us correct information. He argues that there's a kind of the way he says it matches what we find in Greek literature when you're giving people directions. There is present tense by the, near the gate. When you mention near the gate, it's kind of like he says giving a postal code. And when you could see it again and again in history books, that it's a kind of a way of stating when you go to that, you expect to find this still there. So he says it's very clear evidence that John was written before the fall of Jerusalem. What do you think about arguments like that or any other things that since you've written John, what do you think about the dating of John?
I've always dated John in the mid-90s, but having said that, if it's dated before 70, that's all the better. My argument has been John accurately presents things from Jerusalem. He even seems to know what the readings were on the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles.
That's right.
Some of his audience, most of his audience probably wouldn't know those things. And so I've said, John is accurate even when he's not trying to convey something that his audience would know about the topography of Jerusalem. If he's writing before 70, like you said, maybe he's appealing to members of his audience who actually has spent time in Jerusalem.
I want to jump into your book on suffering just a bit. You open with this chapter called "Jesus is Worth Everything," and it's part of your story. You shared that at the beginning, realizing that if you're going to follow Jesus, it means following Jesus with everything you have. Why does suffering come with following him?
One of the big reasons is we live in a world that is often hostile to following him. I mean, that's more true in some places right now than in others. Global Christian Relief, as I recall, 2024, they documented nearly 10,000 Christians killed for their faith in northern Nigeria. And we could give examples from so many parts of the world. I myself, because it was people who brought me the gospel on the street, I didn't want anybody to be in my situation of not hearing the gospel. So as a young Christian, I used to share the gospel on the street. And sometimes I was beaten or had my life threatened for doing that. Now, it gets more sophisticated as you go up the academic ladder, I suppose. When I was at Duke, there was one professor, not the one I mentioned, and not in New Testament, but there was one professor who said, I was his most encyclopedic graduate student. I know he had said that to at least one other student too, but I was his most encyclopedic graduate student, but I might not be allowed to graduate because I was openly religious. Again, the other professors at Duke weren't like that either, but it was like, well, I really do want to graduate, but I've been beaten and had my life threatened for following Christ. I'm not going to let this intimidate me. Although I did go and ask one of my other professors, am I not going to be allowed to graduate? But, there's other suffering in the world too. We are mortal in this life. And theologically, on the one hand, I think that our sharing the world's suffering and mortality in a general way means that they can have the chance to look at people who suffer the same things they do, but can go through them with hope because we know what awaits us afterwards. And on the other, I think also it's important to remember that what Jesus introduced the kingdom, but he didn't complete that, because on the day of judgment, once the day of judgment comes, we're not going to have any more opportunities to hear the gospel and get born for the past couple thousand years and live for the past couple thousand years. So we often speak of this theologically as the already not yet of the kingdom. Jesus, when John the Baptist sends to him and says, are you the one to come, or should we look for somebody else? I said, you're going to baptize in the Holy Spirit and fire, but I don't see any fire. And Jesus sent back with the words of Isaiah, talking about his healings and so forth as signs of the kingdom. These are a foretaste. They're not the completion of all that Isaiah promised, but they're part of it. And when he was being confronted for casting out demons, he said, if I by the Spirit of God or by the finger of God am casting out these demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. He was saying that his ministry was a foretaste of the kingdom, but it's like starts as a little seed before it becomes a mighty tree. It's a foretaste. And so when God does anything for us in this life, when he heals us, certainly when he saves us, these are a foretaste of the promise, a reminder that God hasn't forgotten what he's promised us. But a foretaste isn't the completion. And so there's still sickness, there's still death, until the day that he wipes away every tear from our eyes.
And even if he does heal you, like he raises Lazarus, your Lazarus still died.
Yeah, he still
Later.
died again. Exactly. We're still mortal. Yes.
I love the line you mentioned about John the Baptist, because he said that line, are you still the one to come, or should we look for another, in a moment of his own suffering? He
Yes.
he was imprisoned, and this is the Messiah who's supposed to set the captives free, but I'm not free. Are you really the guy? And he was the guy who preached the sermon, you behold the Lamb. And here's he's not believing in the message of his own sermons, essentially, or at least he's questioning it. And Jesus doesn't condemn him for asking those questions. He gives him hope rooted in, like you said, he quotes Isaiah, I think 35 and other passages where it's focusing, it's the specific language he gives him confidence that this is the one who will heal the dead, give sight to the blind, all those messianic promises. And that what he told the eyewitnesses, he sends John witnesses, go tell John what you have seen and heard.
Eyewitness evidence. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's witness of what they have seen. They just saw him do miracles, and what the miracles they saw him do fulfilled Isaiah.
Nate, you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I know my skeptical friends would probably jump in here and say that, when the already but not yet kingdom, when that comes up, I remember, many of them saying to me, well, why not? Why not yet? Why not when Jesus rises and, death has been defeated? Why is it just a partial defeat? Why is it we'll get to the real, the full complete thing later. And that's a sticking point for some skeptics out there. How do you think about that problem?
They wouldn't be here if he'd done it all back then. In fact, none of us would be here because, history would have wrapped up right then. But for the sake of giving more people the opportunity to come to faith, it is interesting, John the Baptist's doubt. So questioning doesn't mean we're not followers of God, as Nate has already shared with us earlier. But then, I think both of you have shared that with us earlier. But there are some passages in the New Testament that really sound like it's coming really soon. Actually, some passages say he's coming soon. And those are passages that they're easy to throw us for a loop. But again, hearing them in a first century context, for 8 centuries, the prophets had been saying, the day of the Lord is at hand. He's coming soon. And everybody understood by the first century, it didn't mean he's necessarily coming right away. What it did mean was you always need to be ready. It's a rhetoric of imminence that's a kind of rhetoric of always be ready. But also the already part of the already not yet is there to give us evidence so we're willing to wait. So it's not like, okay, I promise you this, but you're just going to have to hold on for nothing for now. But God gives us a foretaste of it to get us ready for that. And when I was a young Christian, I wanted so much more to get the concrete evidence. I had my own experience, but I wanted the historical evidence. I wanted the scientific evidence and so forth. And there's so much available now that I have access to that not everybody does have access to. But in many places where many people are getting healed through prayer, actually, there have been millions of people in normally unreached areas who have come to faith because of witnessing healing in the name of Jesus that's so different from their ordinary experience, because it wouldn't have brought about the conversion without that. But millions of people have come to faith because of that. One friend from Nepal, Dr. Balkrishna Sharma, shared with me that from his perspective, 80% of converts in Nepal are due to people being healed or released from spiritual oppression of different kinds. So I hadn't witnessed as many of those things myself. I've witnessed a few more by now, but they happen. And
You've seen people be healed.
I've seen people be healed. Yeah.
Wow. I
But
mean,
I
that's
mean,
hard
I
to.
don't see it every day. I'm
Yeah.
not in the kind of settings where it happens every day. Last time I prayed for something to be healed, it was my computer, and I had to just buy a new one. But
Right. Yeah. And then I think that, the skeptical question there is like, well, why is it some? Why isn't it all? And why isn't it every time? Why isn't it
And
only
why is Paul
sometimes? And
sometimes denied, healing? When he
yeah,
had a thorn in
yeah.
his
Paul's got
flesh.
the thorn. Yeah.
Oh yeah, in Paul's letters, he talks about people who weren't healed, as well as talking about signs and wonders. For me, it's not hard, in view of the already not yet, and in view of the kingdom not coming in its fullness. Once the kingdom comes in its fullness, everything's going to be settled. But again, that's not good news for the people who aren't ready for it. And it wouldn't have been good news for us when we weren't ready for it. So I can't really complain about that. But the problem for me isn't so much that it's not everybody. We still have mortality. We don't deserve anything. I mean, we were created by God. Everything, life itself is his gift. And we weren't, I think, physically designed. I don't want to get into controversy, but I don't think
We needed the tree for
animals.
immortality, but we were
Yeah,
exiled from it.
exactly. We weren't physically designed innately for immortality. The hard part for me isn't that there's still sickness and death in the world. Life itself is a gift. And we blew it somewhere along the line. And that's why we are susceptible to certain things. But the hard part for me is why this person and not that person. And that's one I don't have an answer for and won't try to answer.
Do you think that's perhaps what Jesus was saying to John the Baptist when he concluded his message? And blessed are those who are not offended by me. I mean, because John was basically asking, if you're the one who liberates the captives, why not me? But blessed are those who are not offended by me. Maybe it's who are not offended by my sovereign choices to be God. Maybe that's our problem. We want to be God. We want to do it our way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's right to pray for healing for this person and for that person. But it is up to him. And if everybody got healed when we prayed for them, you'd have a whole lot of people becoming Christians. Just like for the people in John 6 who said to Jesus, we want to follow you. And Jesus said, you want to follow me because you want some more free food. You're not
Right.
following me because you believe in me.
Yeah, in a recent interview with Ross Douthat, Bart Ehrman frankly admitted that he didn't lose his faith after becoming, after discovering evidence of the Bible's corruption or anything of the sort. He actually said it was the result of suffering in general and unanswered prayer. Do you think that too often we, in American churches in particular, set people up for failure when they're promised things like 3 easy steps to having your best life now?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
before you
again,
answer, I'll just jump in and say
yeah,
that is from coming from the deconstruction post-Christian space that I was in with my past podcast and work. That is a big one for people. That that this is a major issue for people. So it's important to really think about these things, I think.
yeah, it is. And I think I appreciate Bart being honest about that being his problem. I mean, if I were an unbeliever at this point, with what I know, that would be a big hang up for me. But I think we can either look at the unanswered prayer or we can look at the answered prayer. The unanswered prayer fits the world in which we live. The answered prayer points to a different world.
I think that the unanswered prayer also could be an aspect that we are in exile. We don't have easy access to God because we have been exiled, and we have to figure out on our own whether the potato is safe to eat and whether arsenic can kill you. This is something we have to learn not from a divine voice or something in the clouds. We just have to know it by people who've done this before because they saw Uncle Fred die when he ate the arsenic and not the potato, you know? And we have to make the best sense of living east of Eden. But sometimes, see, this is the thing. Sometimes God interrupts this messy, nasty course of events, and he comes and visits us and heals Lazarus. But I don't think we should expect that. I guess there are a few texts in the Gospels that set us up for expectation, like when Jesus says, when you pray, believe that what you've already received. Do you see that as an apostolic promise? And if not, then how do you explain it in terms of the life of the average believer?
Just before he says that, if you're talking about Mark 11, just before he says that, he says, have faith in God. And so it's qualified by the need that the faith is pointed to God. It's not just whatever we want. And it's also in moving of mountains in 11:23. There's a bit of hyperbole there. I think there's a bit of hyperbole in those promises as well. But
the apostles certainly did a
Jesus-
lot more miracles than we see today. I mean, they rose people from the dead and
Yeah.
and
on the
converted the
cutting
world.
edge of the cutting edge of evangelism, which is like what they were dealing with, we sometimes do see things like that today. Not I don't know of any place where it's 100%, but some places where it's been estimated at 90% of deaf people being healed and things like that. And some of these are people that I know and trust. And other people have been there and witnessed, multiple independent witnesses in some of these cases, and also medical documentation with one team that actually went there when this was happening. So on the cutting edge of evangelism, like what the apostles were experiencing, sometimes God will do this to give people an opportunity who've never been exposed to his goodness in any other way. And yet we see it even with the apostles, like 2 Timothy 4, Paul says, I left Trophimus at Miletus sick. Or Philippians 2, Epaphroditus was sick close to the point of death. God had mercy on him. It's not like he was immediately healed, or like what you said, Galatians 4, Paul himself was sick. So there are patterns that show us what I believe is enough, but they don't do everything for us.
Completely
So
agree.
it's not automatic. People can't just come to God because they see everything. There's still an element of we see enough, we have enough evidence, and we believe based on that evidence. And I think we've got plenty of evidence, especially not everybody has access to it, but the historical evidence, the scientific evidence of a benevolent creator, and so on.
And fulfilled
Where
prophecy.
would you?
Isaiah 53 looks like a chapter in the
Yeah.
book of Matthew.
Yeah,
it was written 700 years earlier.
I read that to an agnostic one time and said, who's this sound like? And she said, the man on the cross. I said, this was written, centuries before.
I read it to family members, Jewish family members, and they said, yeah, it sounds kind of like Jesus. Interesting you would say that because this is from Isaiah. Huh. And then they changed the subject.
If someone wants to kind of look into that more, the healings, I mean, I guess I'm raising my hand here. I would love to look into some of that evidence. Is there a place to go to look?
Is it the book
that you would
Miracles that you read
recommend?
about that kind of thing?
I have a couple books about miracles. The first one deals a lot with Hume and the philosophy of it, and it gave what evidence was available to me, and then tried to have a sifting criteria for what we can depend on the most. My second work was much shorter, more accessible, called Miracles Today, published by Baker Academic. And it gives a lot of cases where I think the evidence is very, very strong. There's also a Global Medical Research Institute, where they actually publish in medical journals, peer-reviewed journals, cases that meet even stricter criteria than, like I use historiographic criteria, but they're using even stricter criteria. Like for me, if you have people healed of deafness when somebody prays for them, or healed of blindness when somebody prays for them, that's a pretty good case. But for them, they go for things where there's no evidence of it ever happening, other than the case that they're working on. So, or no other case other than it being a miracle, no other possible explanation. Because sometimes people could be psychosomatically deaf or psychosomatically blind, or at least psychogenically blind. But there are some people who explain away every case of deafness and blindness being instantly healed is just psychosomatic. When you've got, you're having to explain away hundreds and hundreds of cases. So anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. And I know, like Habermas, I think Gary's gone into near-death experiences as well.
Yes.
I'm curious if
Yes.
that's something you've delved into at all.
I haven't really delved into that, but yeah, I appreciate what Gary has done with that.
Yeah, that's interesting. As we land things here, what would you say to the person? I mean, I guess I'm this person a bit, even before kind of starting to walk away from Christianity, and even now coming back to Christianity. I don't know that I ever can point to a time in my life and say, like, I had this experience of the Lord. I know other people, Christian and those who have walked away from Christianity, like you said earlier, Shane, who have had those experiences, which is actually, it's quite interesting to me that they have walked away, even though they had those experiences, because in my head, I'm like, well, if I had one of those, how could I ever walk away? But what would you say to someone who maybe hasn't or doesn't think they've had those types of experiences, so where they can so clearly point and say, like, that was the Lord, maybe not really seeing miracles, feeling like they're praying faithfully, but it feels in a sense like God is silent to them? Because I think a lot of these people, it's an important subject, because a lot of these people walk away. For me, I came back because of the evidence I saw, first century evidence, Gospels as eyewitnesses, that kind of thing. I didn't necessarily come back because of an experience that I had, but for a lot of people, they're not going to come back because of the evidence. They're going to leave because of no experience, if that makes sense. So I'm just curious what you would say to that group.
In John chapter 20, Thomas says, "My Lord and my God," chapter 20, verse 28. And Jesus says, "Because you've seen me, you believed. Blessed are those who've not seen and yet have believed." I think you get more points, maybe, if you believe without seeing. And then John, I believe he also wrote the epilogue, chapter 21, but he concludes the main part of his book in chapter 20 by saying, "These things are written so that those of you who haven't seen may believe, because we're giving you the testimony of what's happened." I know some people are on the cutting edge of evangelism who see these things regularly. I don't see them regularly. And there have been times in my life where, I'm reading the skeptical arguments and so on, because as a scholar, you're supposed to read everybody, although some skeptics don't read everybody, but I try to read the whole range of arguments. And there have been some times, including during my doctoral work, where I'm like, I know my experience, but what about this argument? What about that argument? And sometimes when I know enough information to say, okay, well, we know enough, but still, what about this argument? What about that argument? There's always going to be those things. And so, again, like John the Baptist or like Thomas, Jesus doesn't throw us away because we entertain doubt. We ask questions. But ultimately, is there enough evidence? Is there a preponderance of evidence? Is there enough to invite us to trust? And I think there is. And there was a time, just to illustrate, it's a different illustration, not about experience, but I was writing my first book on historical Jesus research. So not Christobiography, where I go into all this evidence, but historical Jesus of the Gospels, published by Erdman's. And when I was writing that, I was in this mindset of just taking the points about Jesus where we have the strongest evidence, multiple sources, and not saying that the other stuff wasn't true. In fact, one of my doctoral students who did his dissertation on ancient biographies written by biographers who actually knew the biography, he said he concluded only 4% of that material could be multiply attested. Because, it's a couple thousand years later, you've only got so much evidence left. But we have a lot more than that about Jesus. So I was writing this book, but I got into this habit of just talking about the things that could be multiply attested, I could give the strongest evidence for. And I'd come out from my study and walk into the kitchen. My wife would say something to me. She has a PhD in history, by the way. She'd say something to me, and I would say, "Can you give me evidence for that assertion?" Now, I can assure you that wherever you stand on gender roles, I'm an egalitarian, but wherever you stand on gender roles, you're going to get in trouble with your wife if you say something like that, especially if she has a PhD in history. She made it clear to me, in no uncertain terms, that the testimony of a reliable witness is itself evidence.
That's right.
We have enough evidence.
Yeah,
have
we
more
don't
than enough
question
evidence.
that Antarctica exists. Most of us haven't been there. We know it by testimony. We trust in atoms and electricity. Sometimes we have experience from electricity because we've been shocked, but there are things that we have. Most of the things we know from testimony. And we live in exile. Jesus did interrupt our exile. He came, he lived with us, but he says to Thomas, "Blessed are those who believe and have not seen." I think is hinting that he's not going to stay with us forever. And this is going to have to proceed by testimony. But the thing that's amazing to me is that promise that these things, he will have witnesses that will declare what he said. He says this in John 15. You will be my witnesses because you've been with me from the beginning. And that's how all the Gospels start, actually, in the beginning of the Gospel. But the things he said and did matched the things that were said in 1,000 different ways throughout the Old Testament. And there's no other story like this. That all the things, that this corroborated testimony, we have 4 Gospels, but we also have more than that in terms of the testimony recorded throughout the book of Acts and the epistles, and then the other Christian literature like the Didache and Clement and Barnabas, and then the secular historians like Tacitus and Suetonius. It's amazing that this is the most attested bizarre thing. And even if you're listening to this podcast, skeptical, it's a great place to start to just check it out. Start reading Dr. Keener's work here and check this out for yourself, that there's something here that's worth considering at the very least.
Yeah.
I've never had a vision of Jesus. I have dreams about him, but I've never had a vision of Jesus. I would love to have that, but some things have to wait.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Keener, thank you so much for taking this time with us. I think this is beautiful, and I love that challenge, Shane, to just check this out, just look into this. That's what I did. I pictured the door of Christianity for me was so almost closed you could barely see any light from the other side when I didn't want to close that door. And that's when I was like, I'm gonna look into this. I want to look into this in a deeper way, and found much evidence. And so I thank you for your work, and so many others out there who are doing this. And yeah, look into it and let us know what you find. We'd love to hear from you too if you want to get in touch with us. And Dr. Keener, thank you so much for having this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.